again for all the kind words that I've got this morning for my birthday. Thank you so much. The Lord is so good, isn't He? Gives us another year. He's so gracious. And so I've already got the best gifts that money could buy or money can't buy. And first of all, I got salvation. So no one could give me anything more than that. And then, of course, I got an awesome wife that makes it my days here on earth like heaven. So now what else could you ask for? And so I want nothing. I want zero. I've got everything I could possibly want as far as in relationship and in physical things. So I don't need anything. So I have to tell you, I think as most of you were, I was kind of watching the news yesterday and the TV a little bit yesterday, and I thought about our message and some of the things that we've talked about recently, and well, a couple things. If you don't believe in miracles, you witnessed one yesterday, that President Trump isn't lying in state in the White House right now, embalmed, and you know, it was an absolute miracle that he's alive. Number one. Number two, can come to the conclusion that God still has a purpose for him. Now, I don't know if it's to be the president or not, but I do know this: God still has a purpose for him, just like He has for all of us. And so, number three, I thought about this a little bit, and I thought about, you know, we've talked about the story of Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane. You remember that story? And Peter likely grabbed the Roman soldier's sword, and he's ready to decapitate Malchus, who was the spokesperson for the high priest Caiaphas, who was a Sadducee, and who hated Jesus and everything Jesus represented. But because Peter wasn't a skilled swordsman, he just nicked him in the ear. And kind of like this guy, you know, he's likely, from what we understand, he was about 20 years old, so probably hadn't had a lot of skill with assault rifle. But if it would have been a trained shooter, the outcome would have most likely been different, although God will still have His way even with a trained shooter. But the fact that he was not necessarily a trained shooter, likely, he nicked his ear, sort of like Peter did in the garden. So I thought, that was kind of an interesting thing, along with some of the lines that we've been teaching. So we talked about, in this particular series, we're talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua. And we said, first of all, that there was a temple that Herod the Great had built called the Temple of Atonia, which was a tribute to his friend Mark Antony, who was, of course, we know, a lover of Cleopatra. And it was actually located in the northeast corner of the Temple Mount, and it was actually a huge military complex that housed, hundreds of the Roman soldiers, and also the temple police were there, and they were actually staged at that particular location to protect in case there would be any type of an uprising against Rome. So they were there to protect against Rome. And in the fortress was a place called Pilate's Palace, and that was the place where Jesus was actually brought after being brutally abused by Caiaphas and the religious leaders, and we went in detail about some of that. But Jesus' trial before Pilate placed Pilate in a very, very precarious position. He was in a position that he didn't want to be in. And remember, these scribes and Pharisees had they had an ability to place people in those type of positions. Remember, on many occasions they questioned Jesus, and they always tried to trip him up. And I always kind of equated it to, you know, how would you like to have been I always think back when in the 90s, you know, of the OJ trial, and they had what was called the dream team there of all these highly, highly intelligent, skilled attorneys. And how would you like to have been sitting on a stool in front of all these attorneys, and they're all firing questions at you? Well, that's kind of like what Jesus faced, because these were the most intelligent men of that particular time. And so after the temple police brutally abused Jesus, they delivered him to Caiaphas, and the 100 religious leaders, and then one by one these religious leaders took turns spitting on Jesus as hard as they could, and they repeatedly struck him with fists and slapped him across the face. And of course, the way those religious leaders treated the Son of God behind closed doors is absolutely unthinkable. So when they had tired of their cruelty, they wrapped a rope around his neck and led him like an animal to Pilate. And I think that's kind of symbolically of leading the lamb without blemish, all right? And so Matthew chapter 27, verse 2 says, and when they had bound him, they led him away, delivered him. And Matthew 27 says, to Pontius Pilate, the governor, and the word delivered here actually means this. It means commit, yield, command, transmit, deliver, or hand something over to someone else. So this was the religious leaders' way of saying this: Pilate, we are making Jesus your problem. It is no longer our problem anymore, okay? Now, well, Jesus, of course, when they delivered him to Pilate, it actually created, we said, a serious dilemma for Pilate. Now remember, these Jewish, the Jewish people at that time absolutely hated and detested Pilate because he was so brutal against them. All right. And so Matthew 27 verses 11 through 14 says, and when Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, thou sayest. And when he was accursed of the high priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said unto him, he said, hearest thou not how many things they witnessed against thee? But he answered him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. All right? So in these particular 4 verses here, Jesus is given the opportunity or the chance to speak up and to plead his own innocence. All right? Yet he chose to remain silent and entrust himself into the Father's care. Now remember, we said that when someone was brought before the governor like that, and they were questioned, they had 3 times to answer, and if they failed to answer within those 3 times or give a account of their side of the story, they were automatically found guilty. And of course, Jesus knew this, all right? So he chose to remain silent. And of course, Isaiah chapter 57, verse 7, or 53, verse 7 says this. It says, as a sheep before his shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth, all right? And so Pilate, of course, the Bible says he marveled greatly. And of course, this describes someone who is shocked. They're amazed, they're baffled, they're absolutely at a loss of words or completely bewildered of why is this man not defending himself? Why is he keeping his mouth shut? All right? And therefore, he was completely shocked and he was completely speechless. All right? So now Roman law, we said, stated that every person had 3 opportunities to defend themselves, and if they didn't speak up and of course plead their innocence, that person would automatically be pronounced guilty. And Pilate knew the law, and so did Jesus. So the Savior allowed his 3 opportunities to come and go. All right, but Pilate was not content to let things go in that direction. All right, the Roman governor continued to interrogate Jesus, and he said in Luke chapter 23, verse 3, it says, and Pilate asked him, saying, art thou the king of the Jews? Well, and he answered him, and he said, thou sayest it. So in other words, what Jesus is saying here, if we would paraphrase again, he was saying that you say that I am king, and you are correct. So now this statement would have normally gotten Jesus in enormous trouble just for speaking this. But after he said this, John's gospel tells us that Jesus went on to say in John chapter 18, verse 36, he said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now is my kingdom not from hence. So, what was Pilate's response to Jesus' answers? Well, Luke chapter 23, verse 4 says, Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. Now, the word no fault here actually means this. It means no cause. All right? And so, in other words, Pilate was unable to find a reason to convict Jesus of death. All right? And so Pilate was so convinced that Jesus was innocent that in John chapter 19, verse 12, it says, And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. Now that's very much contradictory to Pilate's character, because Pilate dealt treacherously with Jewish people. I mean, you probably just look at him wrong and your head would be off. And here Jesus speaks up to him, and he's trying to get him off, all right? The word sought here means this. It means to aggressively seek. I mean, he's not doing this just haphazardly, all right? And so immediately Pilate searches for a way to release Jesus and to simultaneously release himself from the dire predicament that Pilate himself is now in because of these Jewish leaders, all right? So the religious leaders, we know, desperately wanted to get rid of Jesus, and especially Caiaphas, because Caiaphas was a Sadducee, and so Jesus' whole ministry of signs and wonders threatened everything that Caiaphas stood for, all right? And so they were working a plan to make it happen. So, and of course, we also know, like I said, that they also hated Pilate, and they wanted not only Jesus out of the picture, but they also wanted Pilate out of the picture too. Now, what they ultimately wanted was to kill two birds with one stone, if we could use that term. So he was, we said, a viciously cruel governor who had shed much blood during his tenure there. And if they were able to remove Pilate in the process of disposing of Jesus, all the better. Now, the plans here of the Pharisees and the Sadducees actually had three parts to it. And I want to give you the three parts to their plan. And number one, they wanted to see Jesus judged by the Roman court, which would ruin his reputation and would guarantee his crucifixion. All right? And so at the same time, it would also vindicate them in the eyes of the people. In other words, they'd be off the hook. I didn't kill Jesus. The Romans killed Jesus. All right? And so at the same time, to ensure that this plan would happen, they falsified two very, very serious political charges against Jesus. Okay, first of all, number one, they claimed that Jesus encouraged people to withhold their taxes, which was not true. All right? Remember what Jesus said? Render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, render unto God what's God's, all right? Secondly, they said that Jesus claimed to be a king. So if these two charges here could be proven, Jesus would be executed for treason against Rome, and they would walk away scot-free. All right, number one. Number two, all right, they wanted to see Pilate removed from office on the grounds that he was unfaithful to the Roman emperor. So if Pilate had allowed Jesus to walk free with the charges that the Jews brought against one of their own against him, Pilate himself would have been executed by Rome for being unfaithful, all right, a traitor. All right. So if Pilate refused to crucify a man who claimed to be a rival king, he would have been looked upon as being unfaithful to Caesar and the Roman emperor. So this would be all the ammunition the Jewish leaders would need to have Pilate removed from power. All right. So now news of his disloyalty would, as bad news does, quickly reach Rome, and Pilate would be charged with treason. And so this charge would lead to Pilate's banishment or death, and therefore, if he let Jesus go free, it guaranteed that Pilate would ultimately be removed from office. So Pilate is in the ultimate catch-22 here. All right, so part 3 is this: regardless of Pilate's decision, the high priest and the religious leaders were planning to take Jesus back to the Sanhedrin and to condemn him for death for blasphemy here, all right? So they had the religious authority to judge him and sentence him to death by stoning for claiming to be the Son of God, all right? So the trip to Pilate's court was simply designed to turn Jesus' arrest into a political catastrophe for Pilate. So there was dirty politics back then, just like there is today. All right. So if Pilate refused to crucify Jesus, they still intended to kill him. So, however, of course, if they could use Jesus to first get rid of Pilate, all the better. All right. So it's no wonder Jesus called them vipers. They were slithering, conniving deceivers. Okay. And so the solution for Pilate was simple: crucify Jesus, all right? So that would satisfy the religious leaders and at the same time absolve himself of any possible charge or treason against Rome. So this would be, it's like a chess game that's going on here. And the religious leaders kind of got a little advantage, so Pilate's definitely looking for a move that's going to get him out of this, all right? And so even though Jesus had 3 opportunities to defend himself, he turned them all down, and Pilate himself is now struggling with condemning Jesus to death. I thought about this, and I thought about this wicked ruler. But he still had a sense to know that what he was doing was wrong. So did Pilate see something in Jesus' eyes that maybe instilled what we would call a reverential fear of God? Was it because Pilate's wife had had dreams concerning Jesus? Was there something about Jesus' peaceful demeanor that perhaps touched or gripped Pilate's heart? Okay. Did he feel that Jesus had already been tortured enough by the temple police and religious leaders? All right, we don't know. Nevertheless, Pilate himself found no fault in Jesus, and now he begins to frantically look for a loophole to release him. And not only to release Jesus, but to get himself off the hook. All right, so the Bible says in Luke chapter 23, verse 5, immediately after Pilate told the chief priests that he found no fault in Jesus, they angrily pushed back. Luke chapter 23, verse 5 tells us, and they were more fierce, saying, he stirreth up people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now, this was music to Pilate's ears. This is the loophole that he'd been looking for. You see, oftentimes when you're, and I suppose when you're with prosecutors or defense attorneys, and someone is giving a testimony or a word on the stand, they're always picking apart those words and looking to get some type of an advantage over the person that they're facing by what's coming out of that person's mouth. And sometimes, we've probably all done this before. We've all got a little bit of diarrhea of the mouth, and we said something that we shouldn't have said, and you can't put the words back in the mouth any more than you can put the cat back in the bag. Isn't that true? And these Jewish leaders made a boo-boo here, because they mentioned the word Galilee. That's his loophole. Galilee. Luke chapter 23, verses 6 and 7 says, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. Now, they didn't say he was a Galilean. They just said that what he had done, the works that he'd done, or what he had done, had begun all throughout Judea, all throughout Israel, beginning at where? Galilee. Well, if it begins there, what does common sense kind of tell us? That's probably where he was from. Oh, Pilate, he's probably in his heart, thank God. He probably didn't say thank God. Maybe he said thank you, Caesar, or whatever. I don't know. But when Pilate, it says in verse 6 and 7, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. Here's an attorney. He's looking for a way out of this, all right? And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sends him to Herod, all right, who himself was at Jerusalem at that time. So Pilate's thinking, this ain't my problem. He isn't even from here. He's from where? He's from Galilee, all right? So whose problem does that make him? Makes him Herod's problem, all right? So he's off the hook now, all right? So now Herod Antipas, that was Herod's name, of course, he was actually the ruler over the region of Galilee at that time, of course, where Jesus was at. And of course, his palace in Jerusalem had actually been built by none other, we said, than Herod the Great, who was the father of Herod Antipas. All right, and of course, it was not very far away from the governor's palace. So these places were all in close proximity of one another. And so Pilate now finds a legal loophole he was looking for to escape the situation. And so since Jesus is a Galilean, he thought Herod should be handling this mess, not me. And I'm sure that made his wife happy too. And so he sent Jesus and his accusers to Herod to hear this matter. Now, in Luke chapter 23, verse 8, it says, "And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had been desirous to see him for a long season." Because Herod, no doubt, had heard of all the signs and the wonders and the healings and the deliverances and everything that Jesus had done, because he heard all these things about him. So the reason that Herod received Jesus is because he hoped that Jesus would perform a miracle just for him. Well, in the end, we know that Pilate would not escape having to deal with Jesus, as we will see on Wednesday. And so Herod would return him to Pilate, forcing Pilate to make the decision that ultimately sealed Jesus' fate and prophetically fulfilled the Father's plan. Leads me to believe, God has a plan for everything. God's going to have his way in the end. Now, I don't believe that God is in control of everything, but ultimately, God will have his way just as he did in the life of Jesus. I'm going to ask Dee if she'd come up and